Riots have exploded on the streets of the UK. Far-right groups clashed with Muslim groups in Birmingham after emotions boiled over following a deadly stabbing rampage. Sky News All-Stars Peter Credlin, Esther Krakue and Andrew Bolt take a look at the unfolding situation. The UK is in the midst of the worst riot in over a decade, explains Sky News All-Star Chris Kenny.
First up, I want to show you what's been happening in England, where they've had their worst riots in more than a decade. They were triggered in large part by the alleged stabbing murder of those 3 young girls in Southport in the north of England, but all sorts of antagonism has come to the fore here, racism and antagonism towards immigrants. Here's the latest from Sky News UK.
Wave after wave, as violence descended. Scenes across the country now at risk of becoming normalised. Among the worst, Liverpool, parts of it set on fire, including a library.
A hotel housing asylum seekers, targeted by rioters. Smashing a window and trying to storm in. The group also targeted the officers trying to protect the building, their weapons, anything they could get their hands on, burning objects in their way. With flashpoints like this continuing to erupt across the country, the Prime Minister with his strongest words yet.
I utterly condemn the far-right thuggery we've seen this weekend.
The riot started when a group of far right-wing activists torched immigrant hotels. Spiked Online editor Tom Slater explains the cause of the violence.
The mood is very sobering as well as horrifying. I mean, what we're witnessing here with people trying to burn down hotels with migrant/asylum seekers in them, people running around immigrant communities shouting racial slurs against Asian Brits. I mean, this is racist violence, the sort of which that people felt had been confined to the history books. And I think we should be absolutely clear, if you're trying to burn down a hotel with migrants inside, if you're shouting those slurs and smashing up minority businesses, you're not expressing legitimate concerns. I think both people across the community, and for whether they're ethnic minorities or not, are horrified by what's going on.
The riots then escalated when Muslim groups counter-attacked the extreme right-wingers. Sky News All-Star Peter Credlin says despite the riots being sparked by the tragic stabbing of children, tensions have been boiling over for a long time.
Violence has escalated in northern England over the weekend. Rioters setting fire to hotels used to house asylum seekers. It's triggered, of course, by the stabbing deaths of 3 young girls at a dance studio in the town of Southport by a 17-year-old initially reported to be an asylum seeker. Well, it turns out, in fact, that the suspect was born in Cardiff, so that's Wales, to Rwandan parents. Well, no one can condone any of the violent scenes we have seen. They are appalling. So to the misinformation. This is an issue that's been simmering for a long time. Even the Hampshire and Isle of Wight police chief, Donna Jones, issued a statement calling on the Starmer government to, and I quote, acknowledge what is causing this civil unrest in order to prevent it. I've spoken to people from both sides of the spectrum, she says, and the only way to stem the tide of violent disorder is to acknowledge what is causing it.
Sky News All-Star Esther Krakue agrees, saying the incident didn't happen in isolation.
Like you said, there is a second story to this, which is this didn't happen in isolation. How did community relations break down to such an extent that we saw this effectively unrelated from what we know so far issue? And it's because of the decades-long protests by people in this country that are saying, listen, mass immigration is a massive issue. The lack of integration is a massive issue. Multiculturalism has failed. You cannot have people coming into this country without integrating. You cannot have people living parallel lives and effectively being allowed to do so by the liberal elite that have run this country since 1997, basically.
The government's response has been slammed by Tom Slater.
If you don't have an honest and open conversation about immigration, legal and illegal, and you've certainly had out of control illegal migration for some time, this stuff simmers. Some of it goes underground. You feed the far right racist element, but you also get a lot of ordinary Brits who feel like there's no national interest being displayed by the government. I have to say I'm critical here of the Tories as much as I am the new government, that the governments, plural, are not acting in the national interest. This stuff doesn't go away if you don't deal with it. You can't sweep it under the carpet. So what's been the response of the politicians?
I think the response from the politicians has been woeful. I mean, beyond the kind of more immediate policing issues, we've seen Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, the Labour Prime Minister, basically seem to set in motion calls for a crackdown, not just on these protests, but on civil liberties more broadly. He said he wants to roll out facial recognition technology, cameras across the country. There's been very vague but pretty sinister talk about the role that social media companies must now play in clamping down on misinformation, which, as ever, if anyone's committing a crime online or off, of course they should face the full force of the law. But asking the state or asking social media firms to be a ministry of truth is woeful. And I think it sends entirely the wrong message, which is that a clear distinction should be made. Of course, if you're engaging in violence, let alone racist violence, there are no legitimate concerns to be reckoned with there. But there were clearly concerns expressed in the wake of what happened last week, in the wake of what's happened over the course of recent years. And yet the response now is just more censorship, more crackdowns. And I think ordinary people are genuinely, as much as they're immediately horrified by what's going on in the streets, there's also an unease about the fact that this is going to lead to less open discussion of these issues rather than more.
Esther Krakue agrees, saying the UK government has betrayed the people.
It's quite telling that when Keir Starmer went to lay wreaths to memorialise the deaths of these individuals that were lost at the dance class, there were people saying, shouting at him and heckling him, saying, who's next? If we can't protect our own children, who is next? Now, you couldn't have imagined that happening in 1997 when Tony Blair became Prime Minister, but it's indicative of, and people are really getting a sense that the politicians running this country have not only betrayed us time and time again, but they fundamentally hate this country, and they're aiding and abetting people that hate this country. There's so many statistics with regards to policing and crime in this country that makes people feel like Britain is now a lawless place.
Reaction on social media has also been brutal, with many lamenting the violent state Britain has been plunged into. This person said it looks like Islamabad, but in Manchester.